see how, yeah, there we go. Let's go ahead and open in prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for your presence here. We thank you that you've brought us here, and we're exactly in the place that you want us to be. We're in smack dab in the middle of your perfect will right now, being here, Father. We thank you for that. Lord, thank you that you've given us your word, and as we open it and look at what you've revealed to us, we stand in awe, Lord, and we thank you that you love us so much to have done that. And Father, we pray that you would just speak to us today, and we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Alrighty. For the next few weeks, I guess, I don't know how long we'll do it. Maybe take some breaks in between. I'm not exactly sure of the format, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some world religions, maybe some cults and things like that. And starting off with Islam. You can go to the next slide. I'm starting with Islam because it's the second largest religion in the world. It's the second fastest growing in the world. There you go. Oh yeah, that didn't come out very well, did it? It was all in color and looked really pretty in Keynote, but then I put it in PowerPoint and it messed it all up. So that's what Microsoft will do to your presentation. But anyway, you can't tell from that chart, but there's like 7 billion people in the world, and something like, let's see, on my chart, 30% of them are Christians and 21% are Muslims. So it is the second fastest growing religion in the world, and so it's good to know something about them. And my focus on talking about these different religions is so that when we encounter people that believe differently than we do, that we'll know enough to be able to build bridges between them, okay? So the goal is always with the idea of understanding someone else well enough that we can communicate the gospel effectively with them, all right? So that's a goal, and Islam is it's interesting to me in particular. My parents were missionaries in the Middle East until I was about 10 years old. So I grew up in Jordan, and part of it was in Amman, which is the capital city, but for several years we were out in a village called Medaba, out in the Jordanian deserts, and my dad pastored a church out there. So we certainly had a lot of the people that babysat me were Arabs, and went to school with Arabs, and my friends were Arabs, and they were all Muslim, of course. So it's just Muslims have a special place in my heart, and so I think it's neat. We sometimes the only information we get about other religions is what we hear on TV and get it secondhand. So I really want to approach it in a way that's respectful to the religion. One of the things I'm trying to do is that if there was a Muslim sitting here, he wouldn't be offended by the things I'm saying. Okay, so that's my goal, and so we'll see how well that works. But go ahead to the next slide. Islam's the second fastest growing religion. You can go on to the next one. Let's see. A little bit about the history of Islam. Gotta have history. I love history. So Islam started basically with Muhammad in around 610 AD. Okay, so it's a relatively new religion, right? Abraham received revelation of God around 2000 BC, right? I don't do a lot with dates. There's like I tell my students, there's like just these handful of key dates, and if you know those, everything else kind of fits in and makes a little more sense. But I remember, taking history in school, and I never really liked it that much because it seemed like all you did was memorize dates, and then you forgot them the day after the test was over, right? So I try just to give just the bare minimum to kind of give you that structure so you know how it all fits. So what I do when I'm thinking of Christianity and is start with Abraham, and Abraham lived around 2000 BC, and so we live around 2000 AD, right? So Abraham was almost about the same before Jesus as we are after Jesus, okay? So that just that 2000 BC Abraham date kind of helps, fit everything. It's like that's the starting point, and here's where we are, and then Jesus is right there in the middle, all right? So then around 0 AD is when Christ comes and the Christian church starts in that first century. So then you have the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls with barbarians coming in and sacking Rome and all that. That was around 400 AD. Okay, so that's another good. I like the round dates too. So 400 AD, Rome falls, and that's kind of the start of all the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. Everything just falls apart, right, for a long, long time. And the Catholic Church kind of gets control politically and religiously. But with the fall of the Roman Empire, you also have the church losing a hold on some places as the empire loses hold on some places, which allows for the rapid spread of Islam. So Islam, again, around 600, let's say, AD, comes after the fall of the Roman Empire, when everything's kind of fallen apart, and here comes this new religion that appeals to a broad sector of people. So Muhammad gets this revelation, according to tradition, Muhammad gets the revelation of the Quran from the angel Gabriel. Same angel Gabriel that goes to Zechariah and Mary. And I just got to say, I love this. This is like a rabbit trail, but when the angel comes to Zechariah, it's one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. Because here's, he comes to Mary and tells Mary, you're going to have a baby, and she's like, well, how can that happen? And Gabriel explains how it's going to happen, and she says, behold the handmaiden of the Lord, let it be done to me according to his will. Well, he comes to Zechariah, and Zechariah, so Mary's just this little young girl. Zechariah is a priest, right? And it's his turn to be in the temple offering sacrifices, because there were lots of priests, and you didn't get, you had to take turns. And so it's his turn. He's literally in the temple offering sacrifices, and an angel appears to him. And the angel says, you're going to, your wife's going to have a son. And Zechariah says, well, how do I know this is going to happen? And I love Gabriel's response. He's like, Gabriel says, I am the angel Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God. It's like, what do you mean, how do I? You're looking at an angel, right? It's like you're offering a sacrifice in the temple where you would kind of expect, if you're ever going to see angels, that would be a good place to see one, right? It's not that just these guys just walk into there, and so it's like, and so Gabriel's like, okay, you're just too stupid to even talk, so just don't even talk until the baby's born. Like, that's not exactly how he says it, but that's the way I get it. It's like, really, if you can't even figure out that this much, then just shut it. So we'll just take care of it from here. So it's that angel Gabriel that supposedly, obviously, we don't believe it as Christians, but they do, that Muhammad receives this revelation. So, okay, next slide. All right, and Muhammad is in Mecca, and when he receives these revelations, and it's probably hard to see, but it's down the lower left-hand corner. Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, right? So that's one of the reasons that and Mecca is the place where we'll talk about some of the 5 pillars of Islam, and one of the things is you have to go to Mecca once in your life if you can afford to do it, right? And the reason they go to Mecca is because that's where Muhammad was from and where he received the revelation, the Quran was given. It's a big deal, right? And so Saudi Arabia is the country that protects that important site. Okay, and Muslims will pray when they pray towards Mecca. So big deal. All right, next slide. All right, so when Gabriel supposedly is giving these messages to Muhammad, and I'm not going to say supposedly every time, you understand. So when Gabriel is giving these revelations to Muhammad. He gives them verbally. Muhammad can't read or write, and Muhammad passes them, tells his friends. They write them all down, and that's what becomes the Quran. But it's literally, as Gabriel is reciting the words of the Quran in heaven, and that's what they believe, that there's like a copy of the Quran in heaven, and what we have on earth is the copy of the copy, of that Quran. And it's the one in heaven is in Arabic, and the one down here is in Arabic. So if you're a good Muslim, you're going to learn the Quran, you're going to memorize it in Arabic. And from the time you're 10 years old, you're expected as a Muslim young child to start memorizing the entire Quran in Arabic. And that it doesn't mean anything. You may not know Arabic at all. That's not and a lot of Muslims don't, but they still memorize. It has to be in Arabic. You can't, if it's, they consider the English translation of the Quran to just be a commentary, not an actual translation, because the only real Quran is in Arabic, so you got to memorize. So a lot of Muslims are memorizing stuff and they have no clue what they're saying. It's almost like we were talking earlier about when the Latin Vulgate for 1,000 years was the only translation of the Bible, and you had to be a priest to even know Latin, but a lot of priests didn't even know Latin, but they knew enough to do the kind of priestly stuff they had to do. Same sort of thing ends up happening with Muslims too. So the Quran wasn't just this one-time event. It was these revelations given over a period of about 23 years up until the time Muhammad died. All right? All right, next slide. So, a little more history. Muhammad is preaching in Mecca, and he's pretty much persecuted there for about 12 years. The people that live in Mecca are basically idol worshippers, and they believe in folk religions and stuff, and they don't believe what Muhammad is saying for the most part. So he faces a lot of persecution for 12 years. All right, next slide. Then his families and followers moved to Medina in 622 AD. All right, so this is an important event for Muslims, okay? This is the time, what happens is this, in Medina, and it's quite a ways away, 270 miles, it's known as the Hajjara, where Muhammad and the followers that he had, I think he had maybe like 100 or so, go with him to Medina. What happened is Medina was composed of several different factions, groups of people, and they were having a lot of strife between these different groups of people. They asked Muhammad to come and help settle the disputes among them. They agreed that whatever decision he made, they would all abide by. So he travels to Medina in 622 AD, and basically they kind of just sort of give him control of the city. And next slide. And that's when Islam really starts growing. So during his lifetime, Muhammad returns to Mecca. First of all, now that he has control of Medina, Islam starts growing rapidly. It catches on there where it didn't really catch on in Mecca. But, so now once he has a lot of people and even, an army, basically, from Medina, he goes back to Mecca and conquers it. And interestingly, all the tribes of Saudi Arabia in his lifetime accept Islam and become Muslim. And within like 100 years, it's like pervasive all throughout the Middle East and most of parts of North Africa. It's like the most rapid spreading religion. To be able to do that within 100 years, I guess it was just, well, as Islam, they like to call themselves a peaceful religion, right? It's interesting, though, that really that phrase is never even used in Islam until after World War I. And we'll talk a little bit about that. They didn't care about being a peaceful religion until they were no longer in power. But what they would do is as they conquered new territory, this is how they would conquer it. They would go in and they'd say, okay, you have three options. You can convert to Islam, and then we're good. Or you can pay us taxes, big, heavy-duty taxes, or we'll just have to fight. And most most of the people around said, hey, no problem, we'll convert to Islam. It's cheaper, and we don't have to fight. So people talk about the fact that Islam spread peacefully. Well, it kind of did, but they had the military might to be able to settle things a little more peacefully. And frankly, most of the people that they conquered, weren't necessarily strong Christians anyway, so they were fine converting. It meant that they could be a part of the Muslim economy and so forth, and they knew they would make money, that kind of thing. So it was peaceful in that sense, and that's one of the reasons it spread so quickly. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is the deal. Muhammad dies, and have you guys heard of Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims? You've probably heard those names. All right. Well, this is where you get those two divisions, and it's important to know that's it's a big deal if you're a Sunni Muslim, whether you're that or you're a Shiite. As a matter of fact, I remember they don't like each other very much at all. So there's a lot of internal conflict between these groups of people. I remember reading a quote from a Sunni Muslim and he said he would rather his daughter marry a Jew than a Shiite Muslim. All right, so that's pretty intense, right? They don't like each other. So what happened is after Muhammad died, you had to figure out. He never took care of saying, okay, this is going to be the leader after me. So they had to figure out who's going to be the next leader. Well, one group of people chose Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr was his name, and another group of people chose his son-in-law. He didn't have any sons, so he couldn't just follow naturally through the bloodline. Okay, and that's how you split it. The Sunni Muslims went with Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, who was also the first non-family member. I don't think he was his father-in-law at that time, to accept Islam, and the Shiites went with his son-in-law. So anyway, if you hear the names of, basically they believe pretty much the same kind of. I mean, it's all almost exactly the same. It's just what you believe about the lineage of the caliphs. They're called caliphates, the caliphs, the leaders that came after Muhammad. All right, next slide. Yeah, so Sunnis believe that the first four caliphs were the rightful caliph. They should be elected by the whole community. And there's no caliph since World War I in the 1920s and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was the Muslim empire throughout the Middle East, and with its bases in places like Constantinople. Well, when that fell after World War I, the Allies partitioned it all up and stuff, and so there hasn't been a caliph or a leader in Islam since then. Recognized by either one, although at least recognized by the Sunnis. The Shiites said that there have only been 12 infallible caliphs and only God can select one. Most Shiites are in Iran and Iraq, and Sunnis are just about everywhere else. Sunnis are the largest group. And Sunnis are also mostly they're in Saudi Arabia, so they control Mecca, and so they have a lot more power than the Shiites. So for our purposes, it's when you're encountering a Muslim, you don't really need to know whether they're a Sunni or a Shiite. It makes no difference. They both value the Quran equally. It's just, I like to point out the differences, because you'll hear that on TV and stuff, the differences between the two, and you may wonder, well, what do they believe differently from each other that makes them antagonistic or whatever, and it's all politics. It's nothing no differences in religious belief, really. So, all right. Interesting that politics can divide people that believe everything else the same, right? All right. So let's talk about. You can go to the next one. Let's talk about. Next one. Sorry. There we go. Let's talk about what Muslims believe. Okay. Muslims believe in God. So there we go. We're talking about bridges and making connections, right? So that's good. The problem is they're very monotheistic. They're like Jews. They don't believe in the Trinity. So they wouldn't believe that Jesus is God. They call Jews and Christians people of the book. Okay, we all they believe in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but they think that the Old and New Testaments got corrupted, so you can't believe everything in them, and that's why Muhammad had to get this vision from Gabriel and set everybody straight. Okay, so basically they think we're right in most ways. We just, are wrong because we don't accept Muhammad as this final revelation of God. All right, so Jesus is a prophet in Islam. The Quran talks about Jesus being a prophet, but he's absolutely not God. He's just, and they, just like Muhammad. Muhammad is a prophet, and Muhammad is not God either, right? So they don't worship Muhammad, even though, you might think they certainly respect him. And if you draw cartoons of Muhammad, you're going to get in trouble, right? But they don't worship Muhammad. So he would be equivalent to Jesus, probably even a little bit better though, because he had a newer final revelation where Jesus, that superseded Jesus' revelation. They wouldn't believe Jesus died for our sins, that kind of thing. He wasn't God, so it wouldn't matter if he died or didn't die anyway, right? According to them. So this is from the Quran. He is God, the one and only God, the eternal absolute. He begetteth not, nor is he begotten, and there is none like unto him. It's interesting that this quote from the Quran, if you are in Jerusalem and if you see the Dome of the Rock, that's the Muslim mosque there on the Temple Mount. And Muslims don't believe in pictures. You never are supposed to make pictures of God or anything like that. So most of their artwork is calligraphy, and it's beautiful, but not really any pictures. So this is written around the outside of the Dome of the Rock, and the church there that is a shrine over the site of the Garden Tomb. It's the Church of the Garden Tomb, or it's one on, I think that's where it is. Anyway, the part of this quote is facing that church, where it says, he begetteth not. So basically they're saying, Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, right? That we know from the New Testament. Well, in the Quran it's saying he is not begotten. He doesn't beget anybody. All right. So there definitely is an issue there, because obviously we believe that Jesus is God, and not only that, he's the way, the truth, and the life. He's the only way, right? And this was all settled for good, certainly by the Council of Nicaea that we talked about before in 325. They established that Jesus. Remember, Arius was a guy that was saying Jesus wasn't. He was God, but he didn't exist forever. He was made by God or whatever. And there was a time when Jesus was not, is what Arius would say, and the Council of Nicaea said no. Jesus has eternally existed with God, which matches right up with the New Testament, because even though some people will say, well, the word Trinity isn't even in the Bible, right? Well, the word Bible isn't in the Bible either, but the word, but the word Trinity isn't in the Bible. But Jesus, Jesus never actually says, "I am God," like in those exact words, but he says it in just as powerful a way more than once. I and the Father are one. It's in John 8 when he's talking to the Pharisees, and he says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." And then he ends it with, "Before Abraham was, I am." And then they pick up rocks and get ready to stone him, because what's he referring to when he says, "Before Abraham was, I am"? What's he pointing back to in the Old Testament? It's like the burning bush when Moses is saying, "Who are you?" and God says, "I am," right? And so Jesus is saying, before Abraham was, I am. Well, that was it for the Jews. They were like, okay, grab rocks, right? So he was absolutely saying, I am God. You're looking at him right here. So those are the kind of things that you may want to talk about with Muslims, because it has to come back to Jesus. That's the the one thing that they reject, um, the key thing that they reject that is so foundational for Christianity that you can't, it's not an option, right? It's not optional whether Jesus was God or not. Right? If Jesus wasn't God, he was just a guy, and he died, well, he could have been the best guy in the world, but he's not going to be able to die for all of us, right? If he's just a guy, he at the best could die for one other guy, right? But that's the whole point of the incarnation, is that it's God himself, right? Jesus is 100% God, 100% man. And so God, who is ultimately worthy, like, who's worth more, the potter or the clay? It's like Jesus is the potter. He's God. He's worth. You can have every pot that's ever been made, and it's not worth as much as one potter. So when Jesus died as God, he was able to die for everyone, right? And so if you undermine the divinity of Jesus, then you undermine the whole point of the whole New Testament and gospel message, right? So we've got to always come back to that. All right, next slide. Angels are fundamental to Muslim belief. Of course, Gabriel is the one that dictated the message of the Quran, and not only that, they do things like they record every person's actions. They're up in heaven, writing down every single thing that you do. And for a Muslim, that's important because works are how you get into heaven. We talk a lot in Christianity about how works are not going to get you into heaven. Well, it's exactly the opposite in Islam. Works are absolutely going to get you in heaven or not, okay? And there definitely is a scale, and you're going to get weighed one way or another. And, things like good works in the Quran, it's either the Quran or one of the hadiths. The hadiths were commentaries on the Quran that were given really early, and they're considered, inspired as well. They're on the same level as the Quran. And it said if for every 10, for every letter of the Quran you say, it's worth 10 good deeds. So that's why they'll memorize the Quran, right? Because that's the best way to increase your good deeds. It's very much a works-based religion. So the angels are up there, man, just like everything you do. Huh? I saw that. Okay, that's going in the naughty column. So, and then they take a person's soul at the time of death. All right, next one. Muslims' beliefs about Scripture. All right, so God gave revelation to Moses and to Jesus and to Muhammad. And like I said before, they do believe sort of in the Old Testament and New Testament, but they believe it was corrupted. And anything that would contradict the Quran, they wouldn't accept that was valid in the Old or New Testament. One of their arguments will be that, look, they'll say, okay, well, you've got a Bible over here, and you've got a Bible, and you've got a Bible, and they're different translations, and they all say different things. So how can you even know which one is right? But if the Quran is in Arabic, and it's always been in Arabic, and there's only one, there's not like the New International Version of the Quran and the New Living Translation of the Quran. It's just the Quran, right? So they can say, yeah, so that's obvious that yours has gotten corrupted along the way. But we'll talk about in a few minutes about how that's they have problems as well with that too. All right. So they believe that God gave revelation to Moses, then to Jesus, then to Muhammad. They're all equal prophets. Muhammad's the greatest because he was the last, but they're all just prophets. All right. Next one. All right, Muslim beliefs on Scripture. Yeah, we've already mentioned this. All right, the earlier writings, the Torah, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Jewish Tanakh. Trying to decide if I even mentioned this. The Jewish Old Testament, for Jews, it's called a Tanakh. That's what they call it. And the Torah are the first 5 books of Moses. Okay, and Tanakh is just I don't know what you'd call it, like an acronym for Torah, the Ketuvim, and the I can't remember the other one. All right, but anyway, the writings and the prophets. So Torah, the writings and the prophets all combined together make the Tanakh, the Old Testament. So they'll believe that, but they believe it's corrupted. The final revelation, Quran, clears up any previous revelation. All right. Next one. All right, so Muslim beliefs about prophets. All the prophets were human, not divine, and preached Islam. So in the Quran, there are stories about Adam and Moses and Jesus and Abraham, okay? And those are one of the bridges that we can use. But they believe that Adam was a prophet, and that Noah was a prophet, and Abraham, and the ones we've mentioned, were all prophets, okay? So it's important to remember that they believe that there's only one God, Jesus is not God, and there have been a bunch of prophets along the way, but Muhammad was the guy that finally gave us this true revelation that supersedes everything else. Interestingly, I've been talking with some Mormons recently, and been reading through the Book of Mormon, and they'll say the same thing, that the Old Testament was corrupted, the New Testament was corrupted, and God had to give Joseph Smith, through the angel Moroni, the golden plates with the revelation that hasn't been corrupted, right? So it's sort of you see the same kind of pattern in religions that come after Christianity, that they'll say that the scriptures you have are corrupted, the ones we have aren't, and that's why you need to believe what we believe. All right, next one. Muslim beliefs on judgment. All mankind will be judged based on their good and bad deeds. Those deemed good enough will go to heaven, the others will go to hell. And that's got to be tough, right? I can't imagine believing in such a works-based system, right? Where all I had to be good enough for everything to balance out the bad things that I've done. It's got to be tough, especially when you don't believe in a God of love and mercy that died for you. They don't believe in any of that stuff, right? All right, next slide. Okay, Muslim beliefs, judgment. Can non-Muslims go to heaven? No. So if anyone this is from the Quran. If anyone seeks a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him. He will be one of the losers in the hereafter. By loser, it was a loser. Yeah. Yeah. Do not pass go. Do not collect $100. So yeah, you're not going. Sorry. All right. So let's talk about next slide. The 5 pillars of Islam. These are the major tenets of Islam. The things that if you're a Muslim, you need to do. This is what good Muslims do. It's not necessarily going to get you into heaven or not, but this is what good Muslims do. It's kind of like, one of the reasons I like talking to Mormons instead of just reading about Mormonism is you start realizing that yeah, there's a lot of these stuff that they're supposed to believe, but really in real life they don't do some of the stuff that you think they're supposed to do. Kind of like Christians too, right? I mean, Christians are supposed to pray every day and read their Bibles, right? All this stuff, and it's like, well, yeah, we're supposed to do that. I kind of do it sometimes, right? Okay, and so with Islam, you're supposed to do these things, and good Muslims will, but then there are other Muslims that are not as good as the other ones. They're not quite so worried about their good deeds versus bad deeds. But anyway, so these are the 5 pillars of Islam. Testimony. To be a Muslim, you have to say this in Arabic. There's no God but God. There's no God but Allah is just a word for God. Okay? And Muhammad is the messenger of God. No Allah but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. So they'll say that over and over again. You got to say that. Right. By the way, just an interesting fact. Because Allah is just an Arabic word for God, when Bible translators were trying to translate the Bible into Arabic, they had to decide what word for God do we put in the Bible. Do we say Allah, or do we come up with some other kind of name? Because if we say Allah, then they'll think, oh yeah, well, I know all about Allah from the Quran. And it's like, well, you kind of don't, you kind of do, and it's all kind of messed up. One of the things about the Quran, as you read through it, it's smaller than the New Testament, so it doesn't take a long time to read through. but it's got tons of little stories from the Bible that just like end halfway through. It's so strange. Like all of our stories, you got the story of Abraham, and it always ends up leading to a point, right? There's a reason that the Bible is telling you this story. Well, Muhammad was in contact with some Christians, but they weren't. They were like a sect of Christians that didn't really know a lot, right? So he got kind of distorted understanding of a lot of these stories, and so a lot of these stories just end right in the middle, and you're like, it just ended. There's no. What's the point you're making? There's no point. It's just so strange. Especially when if you're a Muslim, maybe you don't realize, and you probably don't, that there is the rest of the story. And that is definitely one of the bridges. If you do have Muslim friends and you do want to connect with them, it's easy to scan through the Quran and see these stories and how they end in the middle and say, we are people of the book, and I can show you in the Old Testament the rest of this story, the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I can show you what, because they, anyways, what that all means and how that is a picture of Christ, things like that. So it's definitely a bridge. So yes, so you can get it. They'll say that it's not the true Quran, but it is. There are good translations of it so that you can read exactly what it says. So yeah. So for us, yeah.
Because if they don't speak Arabic as one of their understood languages, how do they know what's in the Quran?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is, when you're in a mosque or whatever, in a teaching kind of setting, are they going to be teaching in Arabic? I think I've never actually been to one, but most of the time, if you're just in the mosque together, the 5 times, if you're there near one during times of prayer, you're just praying. But when they do their teaching sessions, and I've seen some on YouTube or whatever, and they're teaching in English, and sometimes they'll, in their teaching sessions, they'll explain what the Arabic means here. So there will be some of that explanation going on there. But then when you memorize it, yeah, you're going back to Arabic. I think they ended up using Allah. There was more than one Bible translation. But I think the original, sort of the King James version for the Arab, used Allah. Yeah. So, this is a whole interesting. Missionaries have different theories about the best way to reach Muslims, and how to contextualize the Christian message in a way that Muslims can understand it. And so they have these levels of contextualization, they call them. And some people, most missionaries will agree up to a point, and then some missionaries will say, no, that's going too far. For example, by the way, I think Allah, for God, was fine. Interestingly, El is, a word for God in Hebrew, El. We have, Elohim, El Elyon. So El just means God. The Canaanite word for God was also El. El just meant God. So the fact that the Old Testament used El to talk about God when they were talking to Canaanites about God, I think that makes it, you have the possibility that you can use that same kind of word. But these levels of contextualization are interesting. So if you're going to a Muslim country and you want to minister to Muslims, let's say you're starting a church in a Muslim country, all right? If you're in a country that allows you to do that, let's say, pretend. Okay, so churches, mosques are going to face Mecca. Would you face your church towards Jerusalem, or would you not care at all? When Muslims go into the mosque, they take their shoes off. Would you make everybody take their shoes off when you go into church? Because that would make Muslims feel like this is a church. I know what I'm supposed to do here. Most missionaries would be like, that's probably fine. Do you call Allah God when you're praying to God in the church? A lot of them think that's fine too. Um, do you allow a Muslim that's become a follower of Isa, is Jesus, a follower of Isa, to still go to the mosque, but also go to the church? Kind of like the Jews, early Jews, when Christianity was first starting, would still go to the synagogues, but then they'd, on Saturday, but then they'd meet together on Sunday for church. Do you allow them to do that? Can you still say all the it's so? And some missionaries will say, that might be going a little too far. And the highest level of contextualization would be to make your church look almost exactly like a mosque, to even let them go to a mosque and basically say they're Muslim, but that they are followers of Isa. I'm a Muslim, kind of like a Messianic Jew sort of thing, that you're a Messianic Muslim, that you still call yourself a Muslim, you still do everything that Muslims do, but you say you're a follower of Isa. And so some missionaries say that's going too far, and others don't. So, but I don't know if there is like this black and white answer to it, but it is interesting. It's like, how do we get the message of the gospel into a culture where religion defines every part of that culture, right? Because if you look at religion and what it does in a culture like that, religion, kind of like worldview, is at the center. Let's say you've got this pie, right? And religion or worldview is right at the center, and it affects every other piece of the pie. So, for us, religion affects things like the way we dress, right? We dress more conservatively, probably, than people that aren't. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But so I don't know. Yeah, when I was growing up, I was in a pretty conservative group of Christians, and we weren't, the guys and the girls weren't supposed to go swimming together, stuff like that, right? So that's religion affecting parts of your culture. We don't, if a baby, if a person is mentally retarded, we don't kill them. Why? Because we value human life. Why do we value human life? Because we're all made in the image of God, right? And those are the direct reasons for why we don't do stuff like that. It's not just because we're nice people, right? It's because our religion tells us that we are made in the image of God, and everyone's that way, regardless. So religion impacts that, but in a Muslim society, it impacts even more. So saying that you have to completely withdraw from your Muslim identity and become a Christian means that you're not just accepting a different religion, you're changing everything about who you are, right? And so these levels of contextualization, when you're trying to get the gospel in, it's trying to reduce the trauma as much as possible of a person being able to accept Christ and still retain their cultural identity. So it's an interesting question. I mean, there are a lot of books written one way or the other about how to do that and the best way to do it. So, all right, let's keep going. Daily prayers, that's the second pillar of Islam, and you've got to do 5 times a day. If you're in any Muslim country, you're going to hear the muazzin that gets up in the tower, or and does the call to prayer. You might even be in London and hear stuff like that, right? Some big cities you'll hear it, but certainly if you're in a Muslim country, it's just everywhere, all 5 times a day. So you've got to do that. The third one is giving, at least 2.5% of your income. The poor are exempt from this requirement, but they basically do tithing too. All right? And fasting, no food or drink from dawn to dusk during the month of Ramadan, which will be in June in 2017. So that's you guys, you'll all have heard of Ramadan. It's interesting that during the month of Ramadan in Muslim countries, more money is spent on food than any other month of the year. And the reason is that as soon as that sun goes down, they party the rest. It's like having Thanksgiving dinner every day for a month. But on the other hand, they're not allowed to have food or drink, no water. So imagine you're living in one of these Middle Eastern countries where it's 120 degrees, and you're working on a roof all day, right? And you can't even drink water until the sun goes down. So So it's intense. Yeah. Yeah. But it's when you look at their level of commitment to things like that, and they'll say to us, well, you say that you have the true religion, but I haven't seen you doing, these kinds of things that your scripture calls you to, fasting, prayer, stuff like that. So, a lot of Christians I know that work with Muslims will fast during Ramadan and pray. Of course, they're fasting and praying for the salvation of their Muslim friends. I think that's a neat thing to do, and certainly an awesome way to bridge the gap between our beliefs and their beliefs. And the fifth one is pilgrimage. Next one, yeah, there you go. Every able-bodied Muslim has to do the Hajjara if they can afford it. You don't have to. It's just this is another thing that gives you tons of good works on your account, right? And every Muslim wants to. And if you're in a small village and one of the people in your village does that pilgrimage and comes back, they're considered, their level just went way up. Their level of respect in the community, because that's what Muslims do. Yeah. Do they have to walk? No, you don't. But a lot of them will, if they can, a lot of them will walk just to add more good works to the. But it's not a requirement. You don't have to. So. And next picture will show you. Next slide will show you. There's there's Mecca, and there's in this the black box area is a black rock that's a meteorite, I think, and I think actually it was holy even before Muhammad. It was in Mecca before Muhammad started preaching Islam, and he just converted this shrine into a Muslim shrine instead. So it's just a black box with this meteor inside. But this is where people come from all over the world. All right. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next slide is jihad. I just want to mention this briefly because we hear a lot about, with Muslim in relation to violence, especially with radical Islam. I just want to talk about what jihad is. Jihad just means to strive or struggle. Just an Arab word that means to strive or struggle. And it can mean either, most Muslims refer to it as like an inner striving or struggle as you try to be good and do the good works. That's a form of jihad. But the other form is a defensive form of warfare. And they'll say it's only a defensive form of warfare and that it's only been done a few times. And that may or may not be true, but certainly in Muhammad's lifetime, it wasn't true. It wasn't true that it was just a defensive form. It was a very offensive form, especially later in his life. Next one, violence in Islam. The thing about the Quran is that it's interesting. This is one of the things you can probably talk to a Muslim about. The Quran, even though it's supposed to be a literal transcription of the Quran in heaven, but it was because it was given over a period of 23 years, the later parts of the Quran have more weight than the early parts of the Quran. And the problem is the Quran isn't written in chronological order, so you have to get some help to figure out what are the early parts and what are the late parts. But the early parts, in that, remember, he was getting these visions from Gabriel while he lived in Mecca, being persecuted, but he only had a small group of followers. In the early parts of the Quran, most of the quotes are very open towards people of other beliefs, especially Christians and Jews. Well, the last part of the Quran, where he goes to Medina, and now he has a bunch of followers and an army, those quotes are not so good in reference to Jews and Christians. And because they're later, they take priority over the earlier ones. So sometimes what you'll do is you'll have Muslims saying we're a religion of peace, and they'll quote some of the early parts of the Quran that do indicate that, but they'll ignore the latter parts, which actually carry more weight and were involved. Let's go to the next slide, by the way. next slide. Okay, here, this is what I want to point out. During the last 9 years of his life, when he was in Medina, when he had his army and stuff, he was either personally engaged or sanctioned 86 different battles. So that's like, what, almost like 10 a year, right, for those times. So for a religion of peace, that's a lot of battles, and these weren't defensive battles. So. No, the Crusades would have been after this. Couple hundred, 400 years. Yeah, so it would have been after Islam had been established quite a bit. All right, so and here I just wanted to point out, next slide, chapter 9 is the last major chapter of the Quran to have been composed, and it's the most violent. And one of the quotes is, "Slay the infidels wherever you find them." And infidels are anybody that doesn't believe, that's not a Muslim, right? So, and that's just one of them. There's a lot of quotes in that last surah, it's called. There are like 140-something chapters. They're called surahs. And again, they're out of order. So 9 is one of the last ones, but it's one of the earliest ones in the Quran. So next one, sharing your faith with a Muslim. Now, I want to say, I just want to mention those things. I think if you take the Quran literally, there is a lot of violence in it. And the problem is, the good thing is, a lot of Muslims, they're good people, and they're not violent people, and so they're going to ignore the parts of the Quran that are more violent and translate them however they want to translate them. All right, but it's kind of like, it's kind of like if a Christian didn't have the New Testament and all they had was the Old Testament. They had the Israelites going into the land of Canaan and God saying, their sin has gotten to be so much that I want you just to wipe them out, man, woman, and child. Well, if that's all you had of the Bible, right, it would be kind of tough making it into this religion of peace, right? Now, we certainly have more than just the Canaanite invasions of the Old Testament to show us God's heart. But for the Quran, it's kind of like you have those parts of the Old Testament with none of the New Testament ideas about who God is to shape your idea of God. And considering the fact that Islam came 600 years after the New Testament, 500 years at least, you would think that he would have recognized more of the heart of God as he's writing the Quran. But again, I think I do want to point out that Muslims that'll say this is a book of peace are referring to the earlier parts, not the later parts. And so people that are violent Muslims, I believe, are interpreting the Quran accurately, but most Muslims are not willing to do that. Thank goodness, right? So anyway, let's see. What time is it? I got 3 minutes. Okay. All right. So let's go to next slide. Next slide. I've talked about the surahs already. Let's see. The Quran, I've talked about this, and it's filled with stories from the Old and New Testament. And some of the, there's one about Moses being before Pharaoh. Remember when Moses throws down the rod and it turns to a snake? Well, they've got that one in the Quran. But what happens in the Quran is that the Pharaoh's sorcerers all then bow down before Moses and say, "Your God is greater than our God." And then Pharaoh gets mad at his sorcerers and says, "I'm going to have all of you guys, I'm going to chop off your right hand and your left leg and then crucify you." Okay, so it's okay. So the problem is, though, that crucifixion wasn't even a thing until the Persians started it about 700 BC, which would have been way after any of the events in Moses' account. So you've got quite a few anachronisms and so forth in the Quran. One of the things I want to point out is that as I've looked at different religions, I always come back to, well, my first reaction is, why do they believe this? But my second reaction is, the deeper you dive into the Bible, to God's Word, the more things fit together, and the more you see things that you didn't see before. All right? It doesn't just start falling apart the more but all these others, the Book of Mormon, the Quran, they just start falling apart when you start digging. And I'm talking about archaeologically and so forth. That's a good one. There's a story about Abraham talking with Samaritans. Well, that can't happen. That couldn't have happened. Remember who Samaritans were. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians. And the Assyrians, what they would do is they would take big chunks of the people and put them all over the place and bring in other people. And the idea was, if you have interbreeding, well, they're going to be less likely, they're going to lose their cultural identity, and they're going to be less likely to rebel against you. Okay? Well, that's how you got the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the result of the interbreeding after the fall of the northern kingdoms in 722 BC. Well, so you didn't have Samaritans until at least even later than that. Well, Abraham lived, remember when? 2000 BC. So how can you have Abraham talking to Samaritans when they're not even going to be Samaritans for 1,300 years, 1,400 years? So things like that. You see a lot of those kinds of things. So those are the, I guess, never be afraid to study other religions. Or have your kids study other religions. Because the more you look at these kinds of things, the more, to me, it validates the reality of what we believe. They call it the Christian faith, and it is faith. But it's not just completely faith-based, right? I mean, Christianity, everything about Christianity happened in history, right? And, if Jesus wasn't a real person, and he didn't really die, if the disciples were real people, and they died for what they believed, and you go back and you look at the archaeological record. One of my favorite stories is in the Old Testament. King Hezekiah has a tunnel built from a spring under the solid rock to come up inside of the walled city of Jerusalem, so that if they were in a siege, they'd at least have some running water inside the city. Well, okay, where is that tunnel that you built, through solid rock, right, with rudimentary tools and stuff? No one had ever found that tunnel until about 100 years ago. Some archaeologists found Hezekiah's tunnel, right there, right where it was supposed to be. And not only that, there was a sign over the tunnel that said, "This tunnel was constructed by me, Hezekiah, king of Israel." Okay? But for 1,800 years, they didn't even know that tunnel existed. So things like that just validate the biblical text over and over and over again. And there's some archaeological things that we don't have. There's some things where archaeology is silent on, but there's not anything that directly contradicts what the text says. So don't be afraid to study these other things. I mean, if Christianity is true, it can stand up for itself, and it is true, and it can stand up for itself. But these are some of the ways that you can start approaching someone that is a Muslim. Yeah, Pat?
There's a popular misconception.
Oh, yeah, you better use the mic.
Popular misconception that Ishmael was the founder, or at least the forerunners.
Mm-hmm.
His progeny were the forerunners of Islam. But I've heard at one time said that there was no possible way for that to happen. And maybe you could clarify that.
Yeah, I don't know. I do know that in the Quran, Ishmael is the chief son, not Isaac, right? So, and you can kind of see Isaac is the line that Jesus eventually comes from. Ishmael is the one that history says the Arabs descended from. I honestly don't know of any evidence that says they couldn't have come from Ishmael. And it's possible, I just don't know. But what I would probably do is, when there are those kinds of stories, I would again say, yes, Ishmael was a son of Abraham. The Bible talks about Ishmael, and not only that, the Bible talks about his mom. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible is about Hagar going to the well as she's running away from Sarah, right? Who's giving her a pretty hard time, and she's at the well, and the angel of the Lord. So it's not just an angel; it's the pre-incarnate Christ. So Jesus, before the incarnation, comes to her, and we know the angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ because this angel receives worship. Other angels are like, no, you can't worship me. I'm just an angel. But this is, and so he says, don't worry, you're going to have a son too, and he's going to be a great nation. She calls the name of the well Bir Lahai Roy, the living God who sees. Okay, and she goes back to Abraham, and then so that's Abraham 2,000 years BC, and then you have Jesus coming to a well in Samaria. All right, so the first woman at a well was an Egyptian woman, right? So a woman, first of all, in the Old Testament, that was, pretty, yeah. And so an Egyptian woman, so Jesus is coming to a Samaritan woman, again, lower than, as low as you can get, right? So, and so the woman, after her encounter with Jesus, goes back to the village and says, come, you guys need to see this guy. He told me everything that I've done, right? So he saw her and told her. So how cool is that? That when you talk about Jesus, the same yesterday, today, and forever, here's Jesus coming to the lowest of the low, an outcast, not even a Jew, an Israelite, and then 2,000 years later doing the same exact thing to this outcast woman. So those kind of stories are really cool because you can say, yeah, we have that story. Let's talk to you about it. So those are the kind of bridges that are pretty significant.
Another question is Sharia law directly and precisely rooted in the Quran, or is it based on a lot of cultural things that happen outside the Quran?
Yeah, it's on the Quran for sure, because there are a lot of things in the Quran that talk about how men are supposed to treat their wives and stuff like that. But it's also based on the Hadith, which are, right after Muhammad died, a lot of his followers wrote down things that he had said and commented on things, and there are those different traditions. So the Hadith is not like one book; it's a series of different commentaries, but they have as much weight as the Quran for most Muslims, and so you get a lot of it from that too. So the way women should dress and so forth, you do get that in the Quran, but it's expanded on in the Hadith for sure. So, and I'm done. So if there's anybody else that has a question. Let me just mention though too that besides the bridges that of just looking at the Quran, seeing some of these stories that are just incomplete, and using that as a bridge, the idea that God is a loving, personal God that doesn't require you to work your way into heaven is a very powerful thing for Muslims. Their idea of God isn't that way at all, right? So, for them, God is looking at their works, and they're going to be judged. For us, for them, God's looking at their good works. For us, God is looking at one great work that happened 2,000 years ago, right? And He sees that. He doesn't see, all the stuff I didn't do today or did do. He sees that one work of Christ. So that in itself is a very powerful bridge. And again, I'm saying all these things just so that we have just a little bit more understanding of people that may seem a little different to us, and it can be kind of almost frightening sometimes if you don't if all you know about Islam is what you've heard on Fox News or whatever, right? There are people that God loves and he died for them too, right? And so everything that we can learn to allow us to build those bridges is something that delights the heart of God. So, alrighty, let's close in prayer. Father, I thank you that you love us, that you love the entire Muslim world. Father, I thank you that you did die for them, that you're their God too, even though they don't know it. I pray, Lord, that you would allow us to interact with Muslims. Show us some Muslims that we may not even know are Muslims. Father, give us a chance to incarnate the love of Christ